Sometimes the greatest punishment isn't death, it's living with the consequences of doing what's right. Every step Elira takes reminds her of the night she chose mercy over revenge, helping an injured vampire escape when her village wanted blood. That choice cost her everything. 20 years later, she lives alone outside Thornwick, her shattered leg a permanent reminder of her people's betrayal. She was branded a traitor for saving a life. Now strange deaths plague the countryside, and whispers say the vampire has returned. When he appears at her door one evening, unchanged by time, while she bears every year of suffering, Elira speaks the words that have burned in her heart for 2 decades. "They crippled me for helping you." His response will change everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and redemption. What did the alpha vampire say when faced with the woman who sacrificed everything for him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like old grief, thick and persistent, refusing to lift even as the sun climbed higher over Thornwick's modest rooftops. Elira Whitmore stood at her cottage window, watching the distant smoke rise from the village chimneys, each wisp a reminder of the life she once knew. Her fingers traced the worn wood of her walking stick, a gnarled oak branch she had carved herself during the long months of recovery, its surface marked with subtle protective runes that most would mistake for decorative notches. 20 years. 2 decades of mornings just like this one, where she observed the world from a careful distance, close enough to matter in a crisis, far enough to avoid the weight of old accusations. Her cottage sat precisely where the village boundary ended and the wild forest began, a deliberate choice that spoke to her position in this community, neither fully outcast nor truly welcome. The walking stick bore more than decorative markings. Each rune told a story of sleepless nights spent learning the old ways, the forgotten knowledge her grandmother had whispered to her as a child, knowledge that had made the difference between life and death on that terrible night 20 years ago, when she had made a choice that would define the rest of her days. She moved away from the window with practiced care, her damaged left leg requiring constant attention to balance and placement. The limp had become second nature, but the pain served as a daily reminder of the cost of compassion. Some mornings were worse than others. Today, with the damp settling into her bones, each step sent sharp reminders up her spine. The cottage reflected its owner, modest, practical, and touched with small beauties that spoke of someone who had learned to find joy in simple things. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of lavender, sage, and more exotic plants that didn't grow naturally in these hills. Books lined makeshift shelves, their spines worn smooth by countless readings. Most were volumes on healing, both mundane and mystical, but others delved into history, diplomacy, and the careful art of understanding those who were fundamentally different from oneself. In the corner, an ornate herbarium held her life's work, pressed flowers and plants arranged with scientific precision, each specimen labeled in her careful script. To a casual observer, it might seem like the hobby of a woman with too much time and too little company. Elira knew better. Every plant had been chosen for its properties, its potential uses in situations that most people couldn't imagine. Some could heal wounds that ordinary medicine couldn't touch. Others could calm supernatural creatures driven mad by blood or pain. The village bell tower was visible through her kitchen window, its bronze dome catching the morning light. The bell itself had been cracked during the Great Uprising, its voice forever changed from the pure, clarion call that had once rallied defenders against supernatural threats. Now it rang with a broken tone that seemed to echo the fractured spirit of the community it served. Village leaders had debated replacing it countless times, but somehow the damaged bell remained, perhaps because they too understood that some wounds were meant to be remembered rather than hidden. Elira measured grain into a simple wooden bowl, her breakfast routine as precise as everything else in her ordered life. She had learned to take satisfaction in small rituals, finding meaning in the careful preparation of tea, the tending of her garden, the daily maintenance of a life built deliberately on the margins. It was an existence that might have seemed lonely to some, but it possessed a quiet dignity that she had earned through enduring what seemed impossible. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause, spoon halfway to her mouth. Visitors were rare, especially at this early hour. She recognized the heavy rhythm of Marcus Ironwood's draft horse before she saw the blacksmith himself emerge from the morning mist. His presence at her door could mean only one thing: the village needed something from her, despite their long-standing discomfort with her very existence. Marcus dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose strong frame carried too many years of heavy work. His hair, once dark brown, now showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much but continued to hope anyway. Unlike many in Thornwick, he had never treated Elira's choice as a betrayal. He understood the difference between weakness and mercy, even when the distinction cost them both social standing. "Elira," he called softly, his voice carrying the weight of urgent news. "I apologize for the early hour, but there's been another death." She set down her spoon and reached for her cloak. The deaths had started 3 weeks ago in the neighboring village of Millhaven. Strange, bloodless deaths that left local authorities baffled and communities terrified. 2 more had followed in nearby settlements, each more bizarre than the last. Bodies found drained but unmarked, as if life had simply fled without violence or struggle. "Where?" she asked, already knowing she would help despite the personal cost. It was her nature to step toward trouble rather than away from it, a trait that had shaped her destiny from childhood. "Eastbrook." A merchant found dead beside his wagon on the main road. No signs of struggle, no wounds. But Marcus paused, his blacksmith's hands clenching and unclenching. There was something left behind, something you need to see. Elira nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. She had suspected the deaths were not the work of common bandits or wild animals. The pattern was too precise, too clean, too familiar to anyone who remembered the old days when supernatural creatures moved freely through these lands. She gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency, her healing kit, the small leather pouch of specialized herbs, and the compass that had belonged to her grandmother. The instrument looked like standard traveling equipment, but its needle pointed towards something far more significant than magnetic north. The bloodstone at its center could detect supernatural presences at considerable distance, a family secret that had proven invaluable during the uprising and might prove so again. As they prepared to leave, Marcus touched her arm gently. "Elira, you should know there are whispers in the village. People remember the last time deaths like these occurred. They remember what came after." She met his gaze steadily. "And they remember who helped end it. Some do. Others remember what they choose to remember." The truth hung between them like morning fog, persistent, obscuring, impossible to dispel with simple gestures. The village had complex feelings about Elira Whitmore. When supernatural threats emerged, when strange illnesses struck their children, when problems arose that conventional wisdom couldn't solve, they came to her. Her knowledge was vast, her healing skills unmatched in 3 counties, and her understanding of the supernatural world deeper than anyone else's in the region. But they came reluctantly, always with the unspoken reminder that her expertise had been earned through an act they still considered treasonous. They accepted her help while maintaining their distance, grateful for her assistance while never quite forgiving her choices. It was an exhausting dance that had defined 2 decades of her life. The ride to Eastbrook took them through countryside that bore subtle scars from the old conflicts. Here, a farmhouse stood empty, its family lost in the chaos 20 years ago. There, a crossroads still showed stones blackened by fires that had burned when supernatural and human forces clashed in desperate battle. The landscape held memories that wise people preferred not to disturb. Elira found herself studying Marcus as they rode, noting how the years had changed him. He had been a young journeyman blacksmith during the uprising, full of fire and certainty about right and wrong. Now he carried the weight of leadership in the village, his opinion sought on matters ranging from crop rotation to diplomatic disputes with neighboring communities. The changes in his face told stories of hard choices and wisdom earned through experience. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked quietly, as their horses picked their way through a stream crossing. He considered the question with the careful thought she had learned to expect from him. "Do you regret saving him?" "That's not the same thing, isn't it? We both made choices that changed everything. We both paid prices we didn't expect to pay." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "The difference is that your choice might have saved us all, while mine just made life more complicated." She appreciated his honesty, even when it stung. Marcus had chosen to maintain their friendship publicly, standing with her when others whispered accusations. His loyalty had cost him politically, socially, and personally. More than one potential bride had declined his suit because of his association with the village's most controversial resident. As they crested the hill overlooking Eastbrook, Elira felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation her grandmother had taught her to recognize as supernatural resonance. Something unnatural had passed through this area recently, leaving traces that lingered like perfume in closed rooms. The bloodstone compass in her pocket grew warm against her leg, confirming what her instincts already knew. This was not the work of human hands, but it was also not random violence. There was intelligence behind these deaths, purpose and planning that suggested something far more complex than simple predation. The pattern emerging across 3 villages spoke of careful calculation, of someone or something working toward a specific goal that mortal minds might struggle to comprehend. The merchant's body lay exactly as Marcus had described, peaceful in death, but drained of the essential spark that separated the living from the merely breathing. Elira knelt beside the corpse, her experienced hands checking for signs that others might miss. No puncture wounds, no magical residue, no obvious cause of death that conventional wisdom could explain. But there, glinting in the morning light beside the wagon wheel, lay something that made her heart stop. A silver pendant, ornately crafted and bearing a coat of arms, she recognized with perfect, terrible clarity. The symbol of House Valdris, the Alpha Vampire's family crest, unchanged from the night she had cut his bonds and helped him escape justice. Marcus saw her reaction and knelt beside her. "You know what that is?" "Yes." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she lifted the pendant. "I know exactly what this is." The silver was warm to the touch, warmer than metal left overnight should be. It carried traces of power that made her skin tingle with recognition and memory. This was no accident, no coincidence that could be explained away by wishful thinking or rational doubt. Someone wanted her to find this pendant. Someone wanted her to know that the past was returning, whether she was ready or not. As they loaded the merchant's body for transport back to his family, Elira found herself scanning the tree line with new awareness. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger throughout the morning, though she could detect no visible signs of surveillance. Her instincts, sharpened by decades of living on the edge between worlds, insisted that they were no longer alone. The ride back to Thornwick passed in contemplative silence, both riders lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. The pendant rested in Elira's pocket like a coal from an old fire, hot with memories and implications she wasn't yet ready to confront. But ready or not, the choice was being taken from her hands. Change was coming to the valley, whether she welcomed it or feared it. The only question remaining was whether she would face it as the frightened young woman who had acted on instinct 20 years ago, or as the wise healer who had learned to see beyond the immediate moment to the longer consequences of every choice. As the village came into view, its familiar buildings both comfort and constraint, Elira made her decision. Whatever was coming, she would meet it with eyes open and heart prepared. She had paid too high a price for her principles to abandon them now when they might be needed most. The village council convened at sunset, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight of the meeting hall. Elira sat at the far end of the long table, the silver pendant placed before her like evidence in a trial. She had known this moment would come, when her past would collide with the present in ways that could no longer be ignored or politely overlooked. Thomas Ashford, the village elder, cleared his throat with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had shepherded this community through 2 decades of rebuilding after the supernatural wars. 3 deaths now, all bearing the same characteristics, all with this symbol found nearby. He gestured toward the pendant without touching it, as if the metal itself might carry contamination. "We know what this means," muttered Sarah Chen, the Merchant Guild representative. Her fingers drummed nervously against the table's surface. "We all lived through the last time creatures like this stalked our lands. We know how it ended." Elira remained silent, letting the familiar accusations build momentum. She had learned that defending herself too quickly only reinforced their belief that she was somehow responsible for events beyond any mortal's control. Better to let them exhaust their fears before offering her perspective. "The question," continued Thomas, "is whether this represents a return of old threats or something entirely new. Elira, your expertise in these matters cannot be questioned, regardless of—" He paused, searching for diplomatic language. "Regardless of past controversies." Marcus leaned forward from his position near the center of the table. "The deaths aren't random killings. There's intelligence behind them, purpose. Whoever is responsible wants us to know they're here. They want us to find these symbols." Old Henrik, whose farm bordered the forest where supernatural creatures were rumored to still dwell, spoke up with the tremor of genuine fear. "My livestock have been restless for weeks. Cattle huddling together, horses refusing to approach certain parts of the pasture. Animals know when predators return to their territory." Elira studied the faces around the table, reading the complex mixture of emotions her presence always evoked. Fear dominated, but underneath she detected hope, the reluctant acknowledgement that her knowledge might be their best defense against forces they couldn't fully understand. They needed her expertise while resenting their dependency on someone whose loyalty they still questioned. "The pattern suggests reconnaissance," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of study and experience. "These aren't feeding killings or territorial displays. Someone is testing our defenses, measuring our responses, gathering information about how much we've learned since the uprising." "You speak as if you know who's responsible," Sarah said, her tone carefully neutral but her meaning clear. Elira picked up the pendant, its silver surface catching the candlelight in ways that seemed almost deliberate. House Voldris was the most powerful vampire clan in this region before the war. Their symbol doesn't appear accidentally. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Everyone present remembered the stories of House Valdris, the alpha vampire, who had ruled the supernatural community with a combination of brutal efficiency and unexpected mercy. His forces had controlled 3 counties before the human uprising began, and his personal involvement in the final battles had nearly turned the tide against the rebellion. "You helped him escape," Henrik said bluntly, voicing what everyone was thinking. "When we had him captured, wounded, ready for execution, you cut his bonds and let him flee. Every death since then carries your responsibility." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elira had heard variations of it countless times over the years, but it never lost its power to wound. Not because she regretted her choice, but because she understood how it looked to people who hadn't been present in that desperate moment when mercy had seemed more important than vengeance. "I prevented a massacre," she replied calmly. "His execution would have triggered retaliation that would have destroyed this entire region. His followers would have leveled every human settlement within 50 miles. You don't know that," Thomas said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I knew him." The words came out more forcefully than she intended. "I had treated his wounds, spoken with him during his captivity. He wasn't the monster you wanted him to be. He was a leader trying to protect his people, just as you were trying to protect yours." Marcus nodded slightly, offering support without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. He had been present during some of those conversations between Elira and the captured vampire, had witnessed the complex dynamic that developed between healer and patient. Unlike the others, he understood that her mercy hadn't been weakness, but recognition of a larger truth about the conflict they were all caught within. "The real question," Marcus said carefully, "is whether his return, if this is indeed his work, represents a threat or an opportunity. The peace we've enjoyed for 20 years didn't happen by accident. Both sides pulled back from complete warfare because leaders on both sides chose restraint over destruction." Sarah laughed bitterly. "You're suggesting we should welcome the return of a vampire lord who once held this entire region under supernatural rule? I'm suggesting we should understand why he's returned before we assume his intentions," Marcus replied. "These deaths could be warnings rather than attacks, messages rather than predation." Elira felt a flutter of gratitude for his support, even as she worried about the political cost he would pay for defending her perspective once again. The village tolerated Marcus's loyalty to her, but that tolerance had limits that grew thinner with each crisis. "There's something else," she said, reaching into her cloak to withdraw her grandmother's compass. The bloodstone at its center glowed faintly red in the candlelight, its needle pointing steadily northeast toward the deep forest. "The supernatural activity in this region has been increasing for months, not weeks. Whatever's happening now began long before the first death." She placed the compass on the table, its mystical properties immediately apparent to anyone with eyes to see. The council members stared at the artifact with mixtures of fascination and unease. Most had heard stories of such devices, but had never seen one in operation. "This belonged to my grandmother, who served as liaison between human and supernatural communities before the war began. It detects magical presences at considerable distance. For the past 3 months, it's been indicating significant supernatural activity moving through our region, not the random presence of individual creatures, but organized movement with clear direction and purpose." Henrik leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "You're saying they've been watching us for months, planning something?" "I'm saying we're dealing with intelligence, not instinct. The deaths are communications, not random violence. Someone wants our attention, and they're willing to take lives to ensure they get it." The implications settled over the council like a heavy blanket. If Elira was correct, then they were already deep into a situation that none of them fully understood. The comfortable assumption that they could control the pace of events had been stripped away, leaving them reactive rather than proactive. Thomas rose from his chair, decision crystallizing in his weathered features. "Elira, we need you to investigate. Use whatever methods you deem necessary. Follow the trail these deaths have left, and determine what we're truly facing." "And if the trail leads where I suspect it will," she asked quietly, "then we'll face that situation when it arises. But we need to know what we're dealing with before we can decide how to respond." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "You're asking her to make contact with supernatural forces that may want her dead. Her escape of their leader 20 years ago might not be viewed as a kindness by his followers." Elira stood slowly, her walking stick providing necessary support as weight settled onto her damaged leg. "The greatest danger isn't that they want me dead. The greatest danger is that they want me to remember why I saved him in the first place." The council fell silent, recognizing the deeper truth in her words. Whatever was coming would force them all to confront choices they thought they had left safely in the past. The comfortable distance between then and now was collapsing, bringing old wounds and older wisdom into sharp focus. As the meeting disbanded, Marcus approached her with the measured steps of someone choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to do this alone. Whatever you discover out there, you have allies here who remember the difference between courage and foolishness. She touched his arm briefly, grateful for the reminder that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitability. Thank you. But some paths can only be walked by those who know the way back. Outside, the evening air carried scents that hadn't been present during the day. Wild herbs that bloomed only in moonlight, the musk of large predators moving through distant forests, and underneath it all, the metallic taste that accompanied strong magic. Her grandmother's compass grew warm in her pocket, its needles swinging toward magnetic forces that existed beyond the physical world. Tomorrow, she would follow where it led. Tonight, she would prepare for a journey into a past that had never truly ended, only paused long enough for wounds to scar over. The pendant felt heavy in her other pocket, its silver surface carrying memories of a choice that had defined her life and might yet define her death. But as she walked home through streets that whispered with old secrets, Elira found herself looking forward rather than backward. Change was frightening, but stagnation was worse. For 20 years, she had lived with the consequences of her mercy. Perhaps it was time to discover its true purpose. Dawn brought no relief from the weight of decisions made in candlelight. Elira stood in her herb garden, selecting plants with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a journey into uncertainty. Her ancient herbarium lay open beside her, its pressed specimens a catalogue of botanical knowledge accumulated over decades of careful study. Each plant she chose served multiple purposes: healing properties that might prove essential, protective qualities that could ward off supernatural influence, and practical applications that had saved her life more than once. The morning air carried the scent of approaching autumn, crisp with the promise of change that extended far beyond seasonal transitions. She worked with practiced efficiency, her damaged leg finding stability through careful positioning rather than fighting against its limitations. Years of adaptation had taught her that strength came not from denying weakness, but from working with it intelligently. Marcus arrived as she finished packing her leather satchel, his expression carrying the weight of a sleepless night spent in contemplation. He dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of someone whose body bore the accumulated strain of 20 years at the forge, each hammer blow leaving its mark in muscle and bone that protested increasingly with age. "The council met again after you left," he said without preamble, understanding that she would want direct information rather than gentle approaches to difficult news. "There are some who question whether sending you into potential danger serves the village's best interests." Elira smiled ruefully, recognizing the political maneuvering that always followed decisive action. "They fear I'll complete what I started 20 years ago, ensuring the vampire's survival rather than the village's safety." Henrik was the most vocal, but others share his concerns. They remember the stories of humans who allied themselves too closely with supernatural forces. They worry about divided loyalty. She shouldered her pack, testing its weight distribution to ensure her walking stick would bear only the necessary burden. "What do you think, Marcus? Where do my loyalties lie?" He considered the question with the careful thought she had learned to expect from him. Marcus possessed a blacksmith's understanding of pressure and temperature. He knew that the strongest materials emerged from controlled stress rather than gentle handling. His opinion carried weight precisely because it was never offered casually. "I think your loyalty is to principles that transcend species boundaries. I think you see suffering as the enemy, not the creature who suffers." He paused, watching her final preparations. "I also think that makes you dangerous to people who prefer their moral choices simple and their enemies clearly defined." The observation stung with its accuracy. Elira had spent 2 decades learning to navigate the complex territory between absolute positions, finding wisdom in nuance rather than certainty. But nuance made poor politics, and politics ultimately determined how communities survived crisis. "Will you watch over things while I'm gone?" she asked, adjusting the compass in her pocket until its position felt secure. Not the official investigation, the personal concerns that won't make it into council reports. Marcus nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. He would monitor the village's mood, track the undercurrents of fear and suspicion that could transform rational caution into dangerous paranoia. His forge served as an unofficial gathering place, where men spoke more freely than they did in formal meetings, and his friendship with Elira was well known enough that people would share their concerns with him rather than let them fester in silence. "There's something else you should know," he said as she prepared to leave. "Young Beth Morrison claims she saw someone watching your cottage from the forest edge last night. She was returning late from her apprenticeship at the miller's house when she noticed a figure standing motionless among the trees." Elira felt no surprise at the news, only confirmation of suspicions she had harbored since discovering the pendant. Did she describe this figure? Tall, unnaturally still, with a presence that made her horses nervous despite the distance between them. She didn't linger to observe more closely. The description matched what she expected. If the vampire lord had indeed returned to the region, his interest in her would be natural, given their shared history. The question was whether that interest represented threat, curiosity, or something more complex that defied easy categorization. "I'll be careful," she promised, though they both knew that carefulness had limits when dealing with beings who possessed supernatural abilities. "If something happens to me, make sure the village understands that my choices were my own. Don't let them blame themselves for decisions I made freely." Marcus's expression grew troubled. "You speak as if you don't expect to return." "I speak as someone who learned long ago that expecting outcomes and preparing for alternatives aren't mutually exclusive." She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of affection that acknowledged the friendship that had sustained her through 2 decades of isolation. "But I have every intention of returning with answers that will help this community make informed decisions about its future." The path she chose led northeast, following the compass's steady guidance toward whatever supernatural presence had been moving through their territory. The route took her through countryside she had traveled countless times, but today familiar landmarks seemed charged with new significance. Here, a lightning-struck oak where she had once gathered medicinal bark. There, a stream crossing where she had found rare herbs growing in soil enriched by supernatural conflict. The landscape held memory in ways that most people never noticed. Trees grew differently where magic had been used extensively. Water flowed with subtle variations in color and taste. Even the air itself carried traces of past events for those who knew how to read such signs. Elira's grandmother had taught her to perceive these subtleties, understanding that information could mean the difference between life and death when dealing with forces beyond normal human experience. As she walked, she found herself remembering the last time she had traveled this path with purpose rather than casual exploration. 20 years ago, fleeing through these same woods with a wounded vampire whose survival had seemed more important than her own safety. The memory carried layers of emotion. She rarely allowed herself to examine the terror of discovery, the weight of moral certainty, the strange intimacy that developed between healer and patient when death pressed close enough to make pretense impossible. She had been young then, driven by instinct and compassion rather than calculated wisdom. Her choice to help him had been immediate, unthinking, rooted in training that made her respond to suffering regardless of its source. Only later had she understood the larger implications of her mercy, the political and social costs that would reshape her entire existence. Now, walking the same path with mature perspective, she wondered what her younger self would think of the woman she had become. Would that idealistic healer approve of the careful compromises and strategic silences that had defined her adult life? Or would she see betrayal in the way Elira had learned to navigate between competing loyalties? The compass grew warmer as she progressed deeper into the forest, its needle pointing steadily toward concentrations of supernatural energy that seemed to shift and move like living things. Whatever she was tracking possessed intelligence enough to avoid predictable patterns while maintaining direction toward a specific destination. By midday, she had reached the ruins of an old watchtower, its stones blackened by fires that had burned during the final battles of the uprising. The structure offered a vantage point over the valley, while providing shelter for rest and observation. More importantly, its history made it a natural gathering place for anyone seeking to understand the region's supernatural geography. As she settled against the ancient stones to eat her simple lunch, Elira felt the familiar sensation of being observed. Not the casual awareness that came from woodland creatures monitoring a human intruder, but the focused attention of intelligence that recognized her specifically. Someone or something had been tracking her progress just as she had been tracking theirs. The game of hunter and hunted was beginning in earnest, but the rules remained unclear and the ultimate stakes had yet to be revealed. The afternoon shadows stretched longer as Elira ventured deeper into territories where human authority had never extended comfortably. Her grandmother's compass pulled her steadily northeast, its bloodstone center glowing with increasing intensity as supernatural energies grew stronger. The forest here possessed an otherworldly quality that set it apart from ordinary woodlands. Trees grew in patterns that suggested intelligence, clearings opened at intervals that felt deliberate rather than natural, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of ancient agreements and older conflicts. She paused at a crossroads marked by a standing stone, carved with symbols that predated human settlement of the region. The markings represented a form of supernatural diplomacy, warning signs that established territorial boundaries and declared the intentions of whatever powers claimed dominion over specific areas. Her grandmother had taught her to read such signs, understanding that ignorance of supernatural politics could prove fatal for anyone venturing beyond the safety of human communities. The symbols told a complex story of shifting alliances and negotiated territories. Some markings were old enough to be barely visible, worn smooth by decades of weather. Others appeared fresh, carved recently with tools that left edges sharp enough to catch afternoon light. Most troubling were the symbols that had been deliberately obscured, scratched over with deep gouges that spoke of territorial disputes or changes in leadership that had required dramatic revision of existing agreements. As she studied the stone, Elira became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. Not the sudden motion of startled wildlife, but the purposeful approach of someone who had been observing her examination of the markers. She straightened slowly, her walking stick positioned to provide support and, if necessary, defense. The figure that emerged from the tree line carried himself with the careful grace of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory. He was human, clearly, but his clothing and bearing marked him as someone who spent considerable time beyond the boundaries of conventional society. His cloak bore symbols similar to those on the standing stone, and his eyes held the cautious intelligence of someone who understood that survival in these lands required constant negotiation with forces beyond normal human comprehension. "You read the old markings," he observed, his voice carrying an accent that suggested origins far from the local region. "Few possess that knowledge in these times." Elira inclined her head politely, recognizing the careful dance of introduction that governed interactions between strangers in supernatural territories. "My grandmother taught me to respect the wisdom of those who came before. I am Elira Whitmore, of Thornwick village." The man's expression shifted slightly, recognition flickering across his features. "The healer who aided House Valdris during the uprising. Your reputation extends beyond your village boundaries." She felt a familiar mixture of pride and unease at being known for that single choice. Her action 20 years ago had apparently become legend among certain communities, though she suspected the versions told beyond human settlements differed significantly from those shared in village taverns. "And you are?" she asked, maintaining the formal courtesy that seemed appropriate for this encounter. "I am called Garrett, and I serve as liaison between human settlements and the supernatural communities that share these territories. My work brings me into contact with individuals whose choices have shaped the current balance of power." He gestured toward the carved stone. "Your presence here suggests that balance may be shifting once again." The title of liaison intrigued her. During her grandmother's time, such positions had been formal appointments recognized by both human and supernatural authorities. The role required delicate diplomatic skills, extensive knowledge of supernatural customs, and the courage to navigate between worlds that often viewed each other as existential threats. "The deaths in the human settlements, are they connected to changes in supernatural politics?" she asked directly. Understanding that circumvention would serve no useful purpose with someone whose profession required dealing with uncomfortable truths, Garrett's expression grew troubled. "The deaths are symptoms of a larger disruption. For 20 years, the region has maintained stability through carefully negotiated agreements between supernatural communities and human settlements. Those agreements are being challenged by forces that reject the very concept of coexistence." He approached the standing stone, his fingers tracing symbols that glowed faintly at his touch. House Valdris maintained order among the supernatural communities through strength tempered by wisdom. Their leader's departure after the uprising left a power vacuum that has been filled by less diplomatic elements. Elira felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to arrange themselves into recognizable patterns. "You're saying the vampire lord's absence destabilized the supernatural community?" "I'm saying that some creatures view his survival as a betrayal of their right to revenge, while others see his continued exile as proof that human interests now outweigh supernatural concerns. The resulting tensions have made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult to maintain." The implication settled heavily in her thoughts. Her choice to save the vampire lord hadn't simply prevented his execution, it had altered the fundamental balance between human and supernatural communities. His survival had preserved possibilities for peace, but it had also created resentments and power struggles that were now manifesting as violence against innocents. "The recent deaths, are they warnings or preparations for something larger?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Garrett's silence confirmed her fears. "There are factions within the supernatural community that believe the time for negotiation has passed. They view the deaths as necessary demonstrations of power, proof that human settlements exist only through supernatural tolerance rather than inherent strength." He turned to face her directly, his expression grave. "Your involvement in this situation is not accidental. There are those who believe you hold the key to resolving the current crisis, while others see you as a symbol of human interference in supernatural affairs. Your investigation has drawn attention from multiple factions, each with different expectations of what your presence here represents." The weight of unwanted significance pressed down on her like a physical burden. She had sought only to investigate strange deaths and provide answers that might help her community prepare for whatever was coming. Instead, she had discovered that her every movement was being interpreted through the lens of supernatural politics that extended far beyond her village's boundaries. "What would you advise?" she asked, genuinely uncertain about the wisdom of continuing her investigation. "I would advise extreme caution and the understanding that your choices now may have consequences that reach far beyond your immediate intentions." Garrett stepped back from the stone, his expression softening slightly. "But I would also suggest that retreat at this point might prove more dangerous than advancement. You have already been noticed. The question is whether you will shape events or merely react to them." As if summoned by their conversation, the compass in her pocket grew noticeably warmer. Its needle swung toward a heading that would take her deeper into territories where human authority held no meaning and supernatural law governed all interactions. Whatever presence she had been tracking was now actively calling to her, abandoning subtlety for direct invitation. "The path ahead leads to the old meeting ground," Garrett said quietly, reading the compass's direction with obvious concern. "If you choose to continue, you will be entering territory where your safety depends entirely on the courtesy of beings whose understanding of morality may differ substantially from your own." Elira adjusted her pack and tested her walking stick's grip against the uneven ground. "Then, I suppose we'll discover whether 20 years of consequences have been sufficient payment for one act of mercy." She left Garrett standing beside the ancient stone, his expression reflecting the complex mixture of admiration and pity that seemed to follow her wherever supernatural politics intersected with human choices. The path ahead wound through increasingly dense forest, leading toward encounters that would force her to confront not just the vampire she had saved, but the larger implications of living in a world where mercy and wisdom were not always the same thing. The forest grew darker as Elira approached the old meeting ground, though the sun had not yet begun its descent toward evening. Ancient trees formed a natural cathedral overhead, their interwoven branches filtering sunlight into patterns that seemed to shift and dance with intentional purpose. The very air felt different here, thicker, charged with the accumulated weight of centuries of supernatural presence and the kind of profound conversations that shaped the fate of entire regions. Her grandmother's compass now glowed with steady intensity, its needle pointing toward the heart of a clearing that had served as neutral territory for negotiations between supernatural factions since before human memory began. The space itself was unremarkable to casual observation, a simple circle of open ground surrounded by trees that seemed older than time itself. But Elira's trained perception detected the subtle signs that marked this as a place of power. The perfect symmetry of the clearing's boundaries, the way shadows fell in patterns that defied natural explanation, and the profound silence that suggested even woodland creatures recognized the sacred nature of this location. At the clearing's center sat a figure that made her heart race with recognition and memory. He had not changed in 20 years, could not change, given his supernatural nature, but the sight of him struck her with the force of collision between past and present. The alpha vampire of House Valdris sat motionless on a simple stone that might have been placed there for his convenience, or might have existed since the forest's creation. His presence transformed the entire clearing, lending weight and significance to every shadow, every whisper of wind through leaves. In her pocket, she carried the mercy blade, the small ritual knife she had used to cut his bonds during that desperate night 2 decades ago. She had kept it as a reminder of the choice that defined her life, but now its weight felt different. No longer simply a memory of past courage, it had become a tangible link between who she had been and who she was becoming. He looked up as she entered the clearing, his expression containing depths of emotion that mortal faces could never convey. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something that might have been relief, regret, or a combination of feelings too complex for simple categorization. When he spoke, his voice carried the same mixture of authority and gentleness that she remembered from their conversations during his captivity. "Elira Whitmore," he said, rising from the stone with fluid grace that belonged to no human movement. 20 years have marked you well. You have grown into the wisdom your younger self promised. She maintained careful distance, her walking stick providing both physical support and psychological comfort in the presence of a being whose power dwarfed anything in her experience. "Lord Valdris, your return has caused considerable concern among the human settlements. Please," he said with a slight smile that carried genuine warmth, "in this place, at this time, we are simply Elira and Matthias. The titles we wear in our respective worlds need not govern this conversation." The invitation to informality surprised her, though she recognized it as a diplomatic gesture designed to establish trust rather than hierarchy. She had known his given name during his captivity, had spoken it while tending his wounds, and during the long hours when fever made him more vulnerable than any vampire lord should ever appear. Hearing it again brought back memories of conversations that had revealed his complexity, the burden of leadership, the weight of decisions that affected entire communities, the loneliness of carrying responsibilities that could never be fully shared. "Your presence here endangers the peace your absence helped create," she said carefully, testing his intentions through direct challenge rather than diplomatic circumvention. Matthias nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words. The peace was always fragile, built on foundations that required my continued exile to remain stable. But circumstances have changed in ways that make my return necessary, regardless of the risks it poses to existing agreements. He gestured toward another stone that seemed to materialize from the clearing's shadows, an invitation for her to sit that she accepted with cautious gratitude. Her damaged leg ached from the long journey, and the opportunity to rest was welcome even in such charged circumstances. "The deaths in the human settlements," she said once seated. "Your followers' work?" His expression darkened with what appeared to be genuine anger. "The deaths are the work of those who reject everything I tried to build before the uprising forced my withdrawal. There are factions within the supernatural community that view coexistence as weakness, who believe that our kind should rule rather than negotiate." The admission carried implications that made her reassess everything she thought she understood about the current situation. "You're saying you didn't order the killings?" "I'm saying that my return was prompted by the killings, not the cause of them. The symbols left at each death scene were placed to implicate House Valdris in actions we had no part in creating." His hands clenched involuntarily, revealing the depth of his frustration. "My enemies seek to force me into open conflict by making me responsible for atrocities I would never sanction." Elira studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only the familiar complexity that had made her choose mercy over justice 20 years ago. He possessed the supernatural ability to influence human minds, but her grandmother's training included protections against such manipulation. What she sensed from him felt like genuine distress at being blamed for actions that violated his fundamental principles. "Why reveal this to me?" she asked. "Why risk exposing your location to someone who could report your presence to the very communities you're trying to protect?" Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the clearing's boundaries. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in isolation and the burden of choices that had shaped decades of consequences. "Because 20 years ago, you alone saw past the surface of our conflict to recognize the larger principles at stake. You risked everything to preserve the possibility that supernatural and human communities might find ways to coexist rather than destroy each other." He met her eyes directly. "I believe you still possess that vision, and I hope you might help me preserve it once again." The request hung between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separation and mutual consequence. Elira felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders, not the impulsive choice of her youth, but the considered judgment of a woman who had learned to count the cost of mercy before offering it freely. "What exactly are you asking of me?" she said finally. "I am asking you to help me identify the true killers before their actions trigger a war that will destroy everything we've both sacrificed to preserve." His voice carried desperate sincerity. "The supernatural community is fracturing along lines that will soon make peaceful resolution impossible. Without intervention, the violence will escalate until both our peoples pay prices neither can afford." In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving through the forest with purpose that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Matthias heard them too, his supernatural senses detecting details that remained beyond her perception. "Your village companions have followed your trail," he said, with what might have been amusement. "Perhaps they feared you would not return from this meeting, or perhaps they hoped to witness our conversation for themselves." The approaching sounds meant her time for private decision was ending. Whatever choice she made would soon be observed and judged by others, adding political implications to what had begun as personal moral reasoning. The moment of decision had arrived with the weight of 20 years of consequence and the promise of 20 more. The riders burst into the clearing with weapons drawn and faces set in grim determination. Marcus led them, his blacksmith's hammer replaced by a sword that caught the filtered sunlight with practiced familiarity. Behind him rode Thomas Ashford and 3 other village council members, their expressions reflecting the complex mixture of fear and resolve that came from confronting legends made manifest. Matthias remained seated, his posture conveying calm authority rather than defensive tension. To mortal eyes, he appeared unarmed and vulnerable, but Elira knew that supernatural creatures possessed capabilities that rendered conventional weapons largely irrelevant. His willingness to maintain a peaceful stance in the face of obvious hostility spoke to intentions that aligned with his words about preventing rather than provoking conflict. "Elira, step away from him," Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "We've come to ensure your safe return to the village." She remained seated, her walking stick resting across her knees in a gesture that conveyed neither submission nor aggression. "I am perfectly safe, Thomas. Lord Valdris and I were discussing the recent deaths and their implications for regional stability." The formal title she used drew sharp looks from the village riders. By acknowledging Matthias's rank rather than treating him as a mere supernatural threat, she had positioned herself as a diplomatic participant rather than a rescued victim. The distinction carried political weight that would echo through future village discussions about her loyalty and judgment. Marcus dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Unlike the others, he kept his weapon lowered while maintaining readiness for rapid action. His eyes moved between Elira and Matthias, reading the dynamics of their interaction with the insight that came from years of understanding people under pressure. "The village council authorized a rescue mission when tracking indicated you had entered supernatural territory," he said carefully. "We were concerned for your safety, given the recent violence in the region." Matthias spoke for the first time since their arrival, his voice carrying just enough supernatural resonance to remind everyone present that they were dealing with power that transcended human authority. "Your concern for Elira's welfare is understandable and commendable. However, she is here as my invited guest, not my captive." Thomas raised his sword slightly, though the gesture appeared more nervous than threatening. "We have only your word for that claim. Supernatural creatures are known for their ability to influence human minds and manipulate mortal perceptions." "True," Matthias acknowledged without defensiveness, "but you also have Elira's word, spoken freely in your presence, that she chose to participate in this conversation. Unless you believe her judgment has been compromised beyond recovery, her testimony should carry considerable weight in your evaluation of this situation." The logic was unassailable, but logic rarely governed human responses when fear and prejudice intersected with immediate threat. Elira could see the conflict playing out in their faces, the desire to trust her wisdom warring with generations of conditioning about supernatural duplicity and the inherent danger of treating with creatures whose nature defied human understanding. She rose carefully, using her walking stick for support, while ensuring her movements appeared unthreatened and unthreatening. "Thomas, what I'm about to tell you will challenge assumptions we've all carried for 20 years. I ask that you listen with the same wisdom that has guided this village through 2 decades of peace." The moonstone brooch at her throat began to glow softly, its mystical properties responding to the concentration of supernatural energy in the clearing. The artifact had been passed down through generations of her family, women who served as bridges between human and supernatural communities long before the recent conflicts began. Its activation served as visible proof that power moved through the clearing in ways that demanded respect rather than simple fear. Lord Valdris did not order the recent killings, she continued, her voice carrying the authority that came from certainty rather than hope. The deaths are the work of supernatural factions that oppose his leadership and seek to force him into open conflict with human settlements. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the mounted riders. Henrik, who had remained silent since arriving, finally spoke up with the bluntness that characterized his approach to uncomfortable truths. "You're asking us to believe that a vampire lord returned to our territory out of benevolence rather than hunger for revenge?" Matthias answered before Elira could respond, his tone reflecting the patience of someone accustomed to explaining complex political realities to those who preferred simple explanations. "I returned because the alternative was allowing events to unfold that would result in the destruction of everything both our communities have worked to preserve. The supernatural world is not a unified entity with common goals and shared values. We have our own political divisions, our own extremists who reject coexistence in favor of domination." He gestured toward the forests surrounding them, his movement encompassing territories that extended far beyond their immediate view. "There are those among my kind who view the peace of the last 20 years as a betrayal of our nature and our rightful position as apex predators. They seek to provoke conflicts that will justify the kind of total war that benefits no one, except those who profit from chaos and suffering." Marcus stepped closer, his sword still lowered but his attention focused intently on the vampire's words. "You're saying these deaths are designed to force you into a position where you must either retaliate or appear weak to your own followers." "Precisely. And if I retaliate, human communities will unite against supernatural threats, justifying whatever response they deem necessary for their protection. The resulting conflict will consume both our peoples and leave only ruins for whatever emerges from the ashes." Thomas lowered his own weapon slightly, though suspicion remained evident in his expression. "What evidence do you offer for these claims beyond your word?" Matthias reached slowly into his cloak, his movements deliberately visible to avoid triggering defensive reactions from the armed humans. He withdrew a small object that caught the light with metallic gleam, another pendant bearing a coat of arms that Elira didn't recognize. "This symbol belongs to House Morvain, a vampire clan that has opposed my leadership since before the human uprising began. They believe that supernatural creatures should rule through fear and violence rather than negotiate through diplomacy and mutual benefit." He held the pendant where all could see it clearly. "This was found at the site of the fourth killing, the one your investigators have not yet discovered." The revelation of an unknown death site sent visible shock through the village riders. If Matthias possessed information about killings they hadn't yet detected, it suggested either involvement in the crimes or access to intelligence networks that operated far beyond human awareness. "Where?" Thomas demanded, his authority reasserting itself in the face of information that demanded immediate action. "The trading post at Millbrook Crossing, discovered 3 days ago by supernatural scouts monitoring Morvain movements. The human authorities will find the body tomorrow morning, along with evidence designed to implicate House Valdris in the killing." Elira felt pieces of the larger puzzle arranging themselves into patterns that revealed the true scope of the crisis facing their region. The killings weren't random violence or simple predation. They were carefully orchestrated political provocations designed to destroy the fragile peace that had protected both human and supernatural communities for 2 decades. "You want us to help you prevent a war," she said, understanding flowing through her voice like recognition of inevitable truth. Matthias nodded gravely. "I want you to help me preserve the possibility that wisdom and mercy might still triumph over fear and hatred. The choice you made 20 years ago created this opportunity. The choice you make today will determine whether that opportunity survives or dies with the peace we've all sacrificed so much to maintain." The weight of decision settled over the clearing like approaching storm clouds, heavy with the promise of consequences that would reshape the lives of everyone present and thousands more who remained unaware that their fate was being determined by a handful of people standing in an ancient forest where old gods once walked, and older wisdom still whispered through leaves that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The silence that followed Matthias's revelation stretched taut as bowstring, heavy with implications that none of the humans present were fully prepared to comprehend. Elira felt the familiar sensation of standing at the precipice of change, the moment when all previously held assumptions collapsed and new understanding demanded the courage to abandon comfortable certainties. Thomas sheathed his sword with deliberate slowness, his expression reflecting the internal struggle between decades of conditioning and the pragmatic recognition that their situation required adaptation rather than adherence to predetermined responses. If what you claim is true, then we are facing a crisis that extends far beyond our village boundaries. The crisis extends beyond species boundaries, Matthias corrected gently. This is not simply a matter of human communities defending themselves against supernatural threats. This is about whether two fundamentally different forms of consciousness can share the same world without destroying each other. Marcus stepped forward, his blacksmith's practical intelligence engaging with the political complexities being revealed. You mentioned House Morvain as the faction responsible for the killings. What are their ultimate objectives? What do they hope to accomplish by provoking conflict? Before Matthias could respond, the air in the clearing began to shimmer with the same otherworldly quality that preceded significant magical manifestations. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the shadows between the trees seemed to deepen despite the steady sunlight filtering through the canopy. Elira's moonstone brooch grew cold against her throat, its magical properties responding to approaching presences that carried different energies than those she associated with Matthias. They hope to accomplish exactly what they are about to achieve, said a voice that emerged from the shifting shadows with the smooth confidence of someone who had been observing their conversation for some time. The elimination of those who would compromise the natural order through misguided attempts at coexistence. The speaker who materialized from the forest's edge possessed the same supernatural grace as Matthias, but where the alpha vampire projected authority tempered by wisdom, this newcomer radiated the cold certainty of someone who had never questioned the righteousness of their cause. Her features carried the ageless beauty common to her kind, but her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries spent cultivating hatred rather than understanding. Matthias rose from his stone seat with fluid motion that suggested both greeting and defensive preparation. Lady Morvain, I should have expected you to reveal yourself eventually. Subtlety was never among your more developed talents. The female vampire smiled with predatory satisfaction, her gaze moving across the assembled humans with the kind of assessment a hunter might give prey that had wandered too close to dangerous territory. Subtlety serves no purpose when dealing with those too limited in understanding to appreciate its nuances. These mortals require demonstrations that speak to their most basic instincts. Elira felt her walking stick grow warm in her hand, its wood responding to magical energies that carried the weight of ancient power and older anger. The carved runes along its surface began to glow faintly, protective enchantments activating in response to threat levels that transcended physical danger. You are responsible for the deaths, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that quickened her pulse. You killed innocent people to force Lord Voldris into a position where he would have to choose between retaliation and appearing weak to his followers. Lady Morvain's laugh carried the sound of breaking glass and winter wind. Innocent? There are no innocent humans, child. There are only those who have not yet revealed their capacity for betrayal and those who wear their duplicity openly. Her gaze fixed on Elira with particular intensity. You, for instance, present yourself as a healer, guided by compassion, yet your actions 20 years ago preserved the life of a predator who should have been eliminated for the safety of your own species. The accusation struck with the force of long-held doubts, given voice by someone whose perspective challenged the fundamental assumptions that had shaped Elira's adult life. She had always known that others might view her choice differently, but hearing it characterized as species betrayal by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of supernatural politics added weight to criticisms she had spent decades trying to dismiss. Marcus moved closer to her, his presence offering support without the need for words. Elira saved a life because she believed mercy was more important than vengeance. Her choice preserved possibilities that your actions are now trying to destroy. Her choice, Lady Morvain replied with contempt, violated the most basic principle of survival, the recognition that different species have incompatible interests that cannot be resolved through sentiment and wishful thinking. She gestured toward Matthias with dismissive elegance. His survival has encouraged other mortals to believe that cooperation with our kind is possible when the only honest relationship between predator and prey is one of fear and submission. It was then that the true scope of Lady Morvain's plan began to reveal itself with crystalline clarity. The deaths had not been random provocations designed to force Matthias into conflict. They had been carefully orchestrated demonstrations intended to prove that human supernatural coexistence was fundamentally impossible. Each killing had been selected not for maximum political impact, but for maximum psychological effect on human communities that had grown comfortable with the illusion of safety. "You want them to hate us," Matthias said, understanding flowing through his voice like recognition of an inevitable truth he had hoped to avoid confronting. "You want human communities to unite in fear and hatred so that any attempt at peaceful coexistence becomes politically impossible. I want reality to reassert itself over the comfortable fantasies that your survival has allowed to flourish," Lady Morvain corrected. "Supernatural creatures are not reformed predators seeking redemption through good behavior. We are apex beings whose nature demands dominance over lesser forms of life. The sooner both our species accept this truth, the sooner we can establish relationships based on honesty rather than delusion." The philosophical argument contained within her words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis facing their region. She was advocating for a worldview that made peace not simply difficult, but actively contrary to natural law, a perspective that would justify any amount of violence in service of what she considered fundamental truth. Elira stepped forward despite the danger, her walking stick providing both physical support and psychological anchor to principles she had spent her lifetime developing. "You're wrong about human nature, and you're wrong about the possibility of change. 20 years ago, I saw a wounded being who needed healing, not a predator who deserved destruction. That choice created possibilities that have benefited both our communities." "That choice," Lady Morvain replied with chilling calm, "created vulnerabilities that I am now exploiting to restore the natural order. Your compassion was weakness that must be corrected before it spreads further through either population." She raised her hand, and the air around her began to crackle with energy that spoke of power accumulated over centuries and focused through decades of hatred. But before she could complete whatever action she intended, a new sound emerged from the forest. The synchronized movement of multiple supernatural beings approaching from different directions, with coordination that suggested careful planning. Matthias heard them first, his enhanced senses detecting approach patterns that spoke of tactical deployment rather than casual arrival. "You brought reinforcements," he observed with the resignation of someone who had hoped for better but prepared for worse. "I brought reality," Lady Morvain corrected. "The demonstration that your philosophy of coexistence fails when confronted with those who understand the true nature of power and its proper application." As figures began emerging from the tree line with the flowing grace characteristic of vampire movement, Elira realized that they were witnessing not simply a political disagreement between supernatural factions, but a fundamental conflict between worldviews that would reshape the relationship between human and supernatural communities, regardless of who emerged victorious. The clearing that had begun as neutral territory for diplomatic conversation had become the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether mercy and wisdom could survive in a world where fear and hatred possessed both supernatural power and centuries of experience in their application. In her pocket, the blood-packed scroll that she had discovered earlier seemed to pulse with warmth, its ancient magic responding to the presence of powers that had shaped its creation and might yet determine its relevance to current events. Whatever secrets it contained were about to become crucial to everyone's survival, but first they would all have to live long enough for revelation to matter more than the immediate necessity of choosing sides in a conflict that had been building for far longer than any of them had realized. The ancient clearing transformed from peaceful meeting ground to tactical battlefield as supernatural forces arranged themselves with the fluid precision of predators who had perfected the art of coordinated violence across centuries of practice. Lady Morvaine's reinforcements emerged from the forest with movements that seemed to flow between shadows, their positions forming a perimeter that suggested this confrontation had been planned with military precision rather than improvised around convenient opportunity. Elira found herself calculating odds that defied rational hope while simultaneously reaching for the blood-packed scroll in her pocket. The ancient document had grown warm to the touch, its magical properties responding to the concentration of supernatural power in ways that suggested relevance beyond mere historical curiosity. Whatever secrets it contained might represent their only advantage in a situation that appeared to offer no viable options for survival. Matthias stepped closer to the human group, his positioning clearly defensive, despite the supernatural grace that made every movement appear casual rather than calculated. Lady Morvaine, your quarrel is with me and the policies I have advocated for our kind. These humans are not legitimate targets in a conflict that began long before their involvement. Their involvement began the moment one of them chose to preserve your life rather than allow natural consequences to follow their natural course. Lady Morvaine replied, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had spent decades planning this moment. They became legitimate targets when they demonstrated that human sentiment could override human survival instincts. Marcus raised his sword again, though the gesture appeared more symbolic than practical given the supernatural capabilities arrayed against them. If you believe human nature is fundamentally incompatible with your kind, why not simply withdraw to territories where contact becomes impossible? Why force conflict where none need exist? The question drew a smile from Lady Morvaine that carried no warmth or humor. Because withdrawal allows the fantasy of coexistence to persist, encouraging other humans to believe they can negotiate with forces beyond their comprehension. Better to demonstrate reality clearly enough that both species understand the true nature of their relationship. As she spoke, Elira's fingers traced the surface of the blood-packed scroll, feeling raised text that seemed to shift under her touch. The document was responding to supernatural presence with increasing intensity, its ancient magic awakening after decades of dormancy. Whatever power it contained was building toward activation, though she had no understanding of what that might entail or whether the results would benefit or endanger everyone present. Thomas stepped forward with the dignity of someone who had spent decades leading a community through crisis and would not abandon that responsibility even in circumstances that transcended normal political authority. Lady Morvaine, you speak of natural law and inevitable conflict, but 20 years of peace suggest that accommodation between our species is not only possible but beneficial to both sides. 20 years of illusion, she corrected sharply. 20 years during which both populations grew soft and complacent, forgetting the essential truths that govern relationships between predator and prey. Your peace was built on the foundation of supernatural restraint rather than human strength, making it dependent on our continued benevolence rather than your own capabilities. The philosophical debate continued, while tactical realities shifted around them with increasing urgency. Elira noticed that Matthias's followers were also beginning to emerge from concealment, their positions forming a counter-perimeter that suggested this confrontation would involve more participants than initially apparent. The clearing was becoming the focal point for a conflict between supernatural factions that had been building for far longer than the recent deaths would suggest. Henrik, who had remained silent through most of the supernatural politics, finally spoke with the blunt pragmatism that characterized his approach to problems that required immediate solutions rather than theoretical analysis. "Seems to me the question isn't whether our species can coexist, but whether either of us will survive. What happens if we can't?" His observation carried weight that transcended diplomatic niceties. The assembled supernatural forces possessed capabilities that could devastate human settlements across multiple counties, while human communities commanded numbers and technological advantages that could make existence impossible for creatures that required secrecy and territorial control for their survival. Total conflict would benefit no one except those who profited from chaos and destruction. Lady Morvain's expression suggested she viewed such mutual destruction as preferable to continued attempts at accommodation. Sometimes clarity requires catastrophe. Sometimes truth can only be revealed through consequences that force both sides to abandon comfortable delusions. As she spoke, the blood-packed scroll in Elira's pocket began to glow with visible light that penetrated the fabric of her cloak. The phenomenon drew immediate attention from both supernatural factions, their enhanced senses detecting magical energies that carried significance beyond anything a simple human artifact should possess. Matthias turned toward her with an expression that combined surprise with growing recognition. "Elira, what are you carrying that responds so strongly to our presence?" She withdrew the scroll carefully, its parchment surface now radiating soft light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with heartbeats that might belong to everyone present or to some larger life force that connected all living things. The text written upon it had become clearly visible, though the language appeared to shift between scripts that suggested multiple authors working across different time periods. "I found this in my grandmother's collection," she said, her voice carrying wonder rather than fear, despite the circumstances. "It's a blood pact between human and supernatural communities, dating back to the original agreements that established territorial boundaries and interaction protocols." The revelation drew sharp attention from both Matthias and Lady Morvain, their supernatural senses clearly detecting magical properties that extended far beyond simple documentation. Ancient magical contracts possessed binding power that could influence present events, particularly when activated by the presence of all original signatories or their legitimate successors. "Let me see it," Matthias said, extending his hand with careful formality that suggested recognition of the scroll's potential importance. As Elira handed him the document, the covenant crown that she had discovered in her grandmother's hidden collection seemed to pulse with sympathetic resonance from within her pack. The mystical circlet had been wrapped and stored with the same careful preservation that protected the scroll, suggesting that both artifacts were components of a larger magical framework that her grandmother had maintained through decades of apparent inactivity. The crown represented authority that transcended individual, supernatural, or human leadership. Ancient magic designed to create binding agreements between species whose fundamental natures might otherwise make cooperation impossible. Its presence suggested that her grandmother had been more than a simple liaison between communities. She had been a keeper of magical contracts that shaped regional politics at levels most people never suspected. Matthias read the scroll with growing amazement, his supernatural vision detecting text layers that remained invisible to human perception. This is not simply a territorial agreement. This is a binding covenant that establishes shared responsibilities for maintaining peace between human and supernatural communities. It names specific bloodlines as guarantors of the contract's fulfillment. He looked up at Elira with an expression that combined respect with something approaching awe. Your family line is named as one of the human guarantors. You are not simply someone who chose to show mercy 20 years ago. You are the inheritor of magical obligations that extend back centuries. The information hit her with the force of revelation that rearranged everything she understood about her grandmother's teachings, her own instincts for supernatural diplomacy, and the choice that had shaped her adult life. Her decision to save Matthias had not been random compassion, but fulfillment of inherited responsibility that her conscious mind had never recognized, but her deeper instincts had always honored. Lady Morvain's expression darkened as she comprehended the implications of the scroll's activation. Ancient contracts cannot override present realities. The covenant you reference was created by beings who lacked understanding of the fundamental incompatibilities that make coexistence impossible. The covenant was created by beings who understood that survival sometimes requires transcending individual nature in service of larger principles. Matthias replied firmly, "Its magic responds to present circumstances because the wisdom that created it remains relevant to current choices." Elira removed the covenant crown from her pack, its metal surface now glowing with the same pulsing light that emanated from the scroll. The circlet felt warm in her hands, its ancient magic recognizing her genetic connection to the families who had originally bound themselves to maintaining peace between species that might otherwise destroy each other through inevitable conflict. "The crown and scroll work together," she said, understanding flowing through her voice like recognition of truth that had always existed but never been consciously acknowledged. "They create binding authority that both human and supernatural communities must recognize. My grandmother kept them safe until they would be needed again." As she spoke, supernatural forces continued to position themselves around the clearing's perimeter, their movements suggesting that whatever confrontation was building would involve more than political debate. The peaceful resolution that all sides claimed to prefer was giving way to realities that might require violence to resolve. But the artifacts in Elira's possession represented alternatives to conflict, ancient magic that had once created peace and might yet preserve it if activated by someone willing to accept the responsibilities that came with wielding. Power that transcended individual interests in service of collective survival. The moment of decision was approaching with the inexorable weight of destiny fulfilling itself through choices that felt both inevitable and freely made. Everything that had led to this clearing, her grandmother's teachings, her choice to save Matthias, 20 years of living with consequences, had been preparation for decisions that would determine whether wisdom and mercy could triumph over fear and hatred when both possessed supernatural power and the motivation to use it. The moment Elira placed the covenant crown upon her head, the ancient clearing erupted with power that transcended anything the assembled forces had anticipated. Light blazed from the circlet with intensity that forced even supernatural vision to adjust, while the blood-packed scroll unfurled itself with movements that defied natural wind patterns. The very air crackled with energies that spoke of magic older than the current conflict, older than the political divisions that had brought them to this precipice of violence. Lady Morvain reacted with swift hostility, her centuries of accumulated power focusing into an attack that would have incinerated any ordinary human where they stood. But the crown's protection extended beyond Elira's physical form, creating barriers of crystallized light that absorbed supernatural assault with ease, that suggested the artifacts had been designed specifically to counter such threats. "You dare invoke ancient magics against the natural order," Lady Morvain snarled, her composure cracking to reveal the rage that had driven centuries of planning toward this moment. Those contracts were signed by weaklings who lacked understanding of their own nature. Elira felt power flowing through her consciousness, like rivers connecting to an ocean whose depths she had never suspected. The crown didn't grant her supernatural abilities. It awakened awareness of connections that had always existed but never been consciously accessed. Through its magic, she could perceive the threads of obligation and possibility that linked every being present, human and supernatural alike, in patterns of mutual dependence that transcended species boundaries. The contracts were signed by beings who understood that survival sometimes requires wisdom to override instinct, she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond ordinary sound. The natural order you claim to defend is chaos, wearing the mask of inevitability. Matthias moved to stand beside her, his ancient power combining with the crown's authority in ways that created visible auroras dancing between them. Lady Morvayn, you have forgotten that our kind's greatest strength has always been adaptation rather than dominance. We survived human awakening by learning cooperation, not by perfecting predation. The supernatural forces arrayed around the clearing hesitated as conflicting loyalties warred with immediate tactical necessities. Some had followed Lady Morvayn out of genuine conviction that coexistence was impossible. Others had been motivated by political opportunism rather than philosophical commitment. The Crown's activation forced all present to confront the magical weight of ancient agreements that their actions were either honoring or violating. Marcus stepped forward with his sword still ready, but his stance more protective than aggressive. Elira, what do you need from us? How can human participation support whatever the Crown is attempting to accomplish? The question drew her attention to possibilities that the artifact's magic made newly visible. The Covenant had never been designed as supernatural authority imposed upon human communities. It represented partnership between species that brought different strengths to challenges neither could face alone. Human determination and adaptability balanced supernatural power and longevity, creating combinations that transcended what either could accomplish in isolation. "Stand with me," she said simply. "Let your presence demonstrate that human choice supports peaceful resolution rather than fearful submission." The Crown's power draws from both species' commitment to shared principles rather than individual advantage. Thomas, Henrik, and the other village representatives moved to positions that formed a protective circle around Elira and Matthias, their weapons ready but their postures clearly defensive rather than aggressive. The symbolic statement carried weight that transcended military significance, human leadership choosing to trust supernatural cooperation despite decades of conditioning that taught them to view such trust as fatal vulnerability. Lady Morvayn's followers began to shift positions, their movements reflecting uncertainty about whether their commitment to her cause extended to direct confrontation with magical authority that commanded both human and supernatural loyalty. Some withdrew to safer distances, while others maintained aggressive stances that suggested willingness to fight despite increasingly unfavorable odds. "You offer them slavery disguised as partnership," Lady Morvayn declared, gathering power for another assault against protections that had already proven capable of withstanding her initial attack. "You teach humans to depend on supernatural benevolence rather than developing strength that could ensure their independent survival." Elira felt the Crown's magic, revealing deeper truths about the relationships it was designed to govern and protect. "I offer them the same choice you would deny the opportunity to transcend individual limitation through cooperation that multiplies strength rather than dividing it. Independence built on isolation is weakness pretending to be virtue." The philosophical argument gained substance through magical enforcement that made abstract principles tangible as physical forces. Where Lady Morvayn's power sought to dominate and control, the Crown's authority worked to connect and strengthen, creating networks of mutual support that enhanced rather than diminished individual capabilities. Around them, supernatural beings who had remained hidden began emerging from concealment as the Crown's activation called to ancient loyalties that superseded current political alignments. Not all supported Lady Morvayn's vision of inevitable conflict. and many had been waiting for leadership that offered alternatives to the extremism that threatened to destroy everything both species had built together. The balance of power was shifting, but Lady Morvain possessed centuries of accumulated strength and the desperate conviction of someone who viewed compromise as betrayal of fundamental truth. Her next attack would be designed not to overcome the Crown's protections, but to shatter the human and supernatural alliance that gave those protections their power. Lady Morvain's final assault came not as supernatural force against magical protection, but as psychological warfare aimed at the human alliance supporting the Crown's authority. She turned her attention to the village representatives, her voice carrying hypnotic harmonics designed to awaken every fear and suspicion that decades of propaganda had planted in human consciousness about supernatural duplicity. "Look at them," she commanded, her power making her words impossible to ignore. "See how easily they stand beside the creature who once ruled your ancestors as cattle. Notice how quickly your healer abandons human interests when offered supernatural power. This is how coexistence always ends, with humans serving masters who view them as convenient tools rather than equal partners." The attack was precisely calculated to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities in human psychology. Even those committed to peaceful cooperation carried subconscious doubts about whether supernatural beings could ever truly view mortals as anything more than temporary allies of convenience. Lady Morvain's words gave voice to fears that rational argument could never entirely dispel. Elira felt the village representatives wavering as centuries of inherited caution warred with their conscious commitment to trust. The Crown's power could protect against direct supernatural assault, but it could not override human free will or force loyalty that wasn't freely given. If her allies lost faith in the possibility of genuine cooperation, the magical framework that sustained their defense would collapse regardless of ancient contracts or mystical artifacts. "She speaks to your fear," Elira said, her voice carrying the steady certainty of someone who had spent 20 years living with the consequences of choosing trust over suspicion. But fear has guided human policy towards supernatural communities for generations, and what has it accomplished? Isolation, missed opportunities, and the kind of mutual hostility that benefits no one except those who profit from conflict. Marcus stepped closer to her position, his sword lowered, but his presence clearly supportive. "I've watched Elira for 20 years. I've seen her choose human welfare over personal advantage countless times. I've witnessed her expertise save lives that conventional medicine couldn't preserve. If this is what supernatural corruption looks like, then I'm proud to stand corrupted." His declaration broke the spell Lady Morvain had been weaving around human doubts. One by one, the other village representatives reaffirmed their positions, their choice to trust, based not on naive optimism, but on evidence accumulated through years of observing Elira's character under pressure. Thomas raised his sword in salute rather than threat. 20 years ago, we branded her a traitor for showing mercy. Today, we understand that mercy preserved possibilities we lacked wisdom to recognize. If ancient magic calls us to honor commitments our ancestors made, then we honor them freely, rather than through compulsion. The declaration of renewed human support sent power flowing through the Covenant Crown with intensity that transformed the entire clearing. Light blazed from the circlet with such brilliance that even supernatural vision required protection, while the blood-packed scroll expanded into dimensions that allowed its full text to become visible to all present. The complete contract revealed obligations and protections that extended far beyond territorial agreements or diplomatic protocols. It established magical frameworks for mutual defense, shared resources, and coordinated responses to threats that endangered both species. Most importantly, it created binding mechanisms that prevented either side from abandoning their commitments when cooperation became difficult or politically inconvenient. Lady Morvain stared at the revealed text with growing horror as she comprehended the full scope of what she had been attempting to destroy. You would bind our kind to eternal servitude, disguised as partnership. You would deny us the right to pursue our nature freely. We would bind all parties to honor commitments that transcend individual convenience. Matthias replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent centuries learning the difference between strength and tyranny. Freedom without responsibility is chaos. Nature without wisdom is destruction. Around them, supernatural beings who had supported Lady Morvaine's cause began withdrawing their allegiance as the Crown's power revealed the true implications of her vision. Total conflict would result not in supernatural dominance, but in mutual annihilation that would leave both species vulnerable to threats neither could face alone. The wisdom embedded in ancient covenants had anticipated consequences that short-term thinking could never adequately address. Lady Morvaine found herself increasingly isolated, as former allies recognized that her philosophy led ultimately to the destruction of everything they had worked to preserve. Her power remained formidable, but power without support becomes increasingly brittle until even supernatural strength cannot overcome organized opposition. "This is not finished," she declared, gathering her remaining followers for withdrawal rather than continued confrontation. Contracts written by ancient fools cannot override the realities that govern relationships between predator and prey. You will discover the price of denying natural law. As she and her diminished faction melted back into the forest shadows, the immediate threat receded, but the larger work of rebuilding trust and cooperation remained. The Covenant Crown had prevented war, but lasting peace would require daily choices from both human and supernatural communities to honor commitments that challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of strength, security, and survival. Elira removed the crown from her head, its weight somehow lighter now that its power had been acknowledged and accepted by witnesses from both species. The phoenix feather quill that would be needed to formalize new agreements appeared in her hand as if summoned by the magic itself, its presence indicating that ancient wisdom included practical tools for implementing the principles it protected. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in decades, both species could approach that work as partners rather than rivals. 6 months after the confrontation in the ancient clearing, Elira stood in her expanded cottage garden, watching the morning mist lift from valleys that had learned to hold both human and supernatural presence without fear. The walking stick in her hand bore new runes, carved during winter evenings, spent in conversation with beings whose wisdom spanned centuries. Her limp remained unchanged, but its meaning had transformed from symbol of sacrifice to reminder of the price willingly paid for understanding that transcended species boundaries. The cottage itself had grown to accommodate her new role as official liaison between human and supernatural communities. Additional rooms housed the artifacts that sustained magical agreements, while a meeting hall provided space for negotiations that shaped regional policy. But the heart of her home remained unchanged. The simple kitchen where she prepared tea, the herb garden where she gathered healing plants, and the comfortable chair by the window where she spent quiet evenings reading and reflecting on how far they had all traveled from the fears that once defined their relationships. Marcus approached through the morning light, his movements carrying the satisfied weariness of someone whose forge now served both human and supernatural communities. His work had expanded beyond simple metalworking to include the creation of tools that functioned reliably in environments where magic and technology intersected. The wedding ring on his finger caught the sunlight, a symbol of commitments that had deepened through shared purpose rather than romantic convenience. "The memorial garden stone is ready," he announced, settling beside her on the bench they had placed to overlook the valley. The inscription includes names from both communities, human and supernatural alike, who died during the conflicts that led to our current peace. Elira nodded, touched by his attention to details that honored complexity rather than simplifying it for political convenience. The memorial would acknowledge victims of violence while celebrating the wisdom that had chosen healing over perpetual vengeance. Both species had lost individuals to fear and misunderstanding. Both had gained futures that seemed impossible before cooperation replaced competition as the governing principle of their relationship. Matthias sent word that the Northern Territories have formally requested mediation services for establishing their own coexistence agreements. She continued, sharing news that had arrived with the morning's correspondence. Our success here has encouraged other regions to attempt similar arrangements. The expansion of peaceful cooperation beyond their immediate area represented validation of principles that had seemed naive to many observers. But practical results spoke more persuasively than theoretical arguments, and communities that had once viewed supernatural presence as existential threat were beginning to recognize the benefits of alliance over opposition. "Will you accept their request?" Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already knew her answer. "We will accept it," she corrected gently. "This work requires partnership rather than individual effort. The Covenant's power draws from cooperation between human and supernatural wisdom, not from any single person's capabilities." Through the morning air came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving with the relaxed confidence of those who traveled through territory where their presence was welcome rather than merely tolerated. The delegation included both human and supernatural representatives, their mixed composition now common enough to draw little notice from local farmers who had learned to judge visitors by their intentions rather than their species. At their head rode a figure whose presence carried the weight of authority tempered by hard-earned wisdom. Matthias had established his own permanent residence in the region, abandoning the isolation that exile had required in favor of active participation in building the future his survival had made possible. His transformation from distant legend to engaged community member represented the kind of change that gave hope substance beyond mere wishful thinking. "The trade agreements are finalized," he announced as the delegation dismounted. "Human craftsmanship combined with supernatural preservation techniques will create products that benefit both economies while demonstrating the practical value of continued cooperation." Economic interdependence provided stability that transcended political rhetoric or philosophical argument. When communities depended on each other for prosperity, rather than merely tolerating each other's existence, the incentives for maintaining peace became powerful enough to override temporary conflicts or misunderstandings. Elira rose to greet the delegation, her movement automatic despite the morning stiffness in her damaged leg. The limp that had once marked her as traitor now identified her as the woman who had chosen wisdom over convention, making her a symbol of hope rather than shame. Children in both human and supernatural communities learned her story as an example of how individual choices could shape collective destiny when guided by principles larger than immediate self-interest. "There's news from the southern regions as well," reported Sarah Chen, who had expanded her merchant activities to include trade with supernatural communities whose products required specialized knowledge to transport safely. "Lady Morvaine's faction has fragmented. Some of her followers have requested amnesty in exchange for cooperation with the new agreements." The information carried complexity that required careful consideration rather than immediate response. Justice demanded accountability for the deaths that had precipitated their crisis, but wisdom recognized that revenge would only perpetuate cycles of violence that served no constructive purpose. The Covenant's framework provided mechanisms for addressing such situations through restorative rather than purely punitive approaches. "We'll consider each case individually," Elira decided, understanding that mercy required discernment rather than blanket forgiveness. Some actions demand consequences, but those consequences should serve healing rather than perpetual punishment. As the delegation settled into the meeting hall to discuss the practical details of expanding cooperation, Elira found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 20 years of living with the consequences of one choice had taught her that individual actions could echo through decades in ways impossible to predict. Her decision to cut a vampire's bonds had seemed like simple compassion at the time, but it had preserved possibilities that continued to unfold in directions she could never have anticipated. The memorial garden stone would be placed tomorrow in a ceremony attended by representatives from every community that had contributed to their current peace. The inscription would read simply, "In memory of those who died learning to live together, and in hope for those who choose to continue their work." Elira smiled, satisfied that her walking stick would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead, supported by wisdom earned through experience and partnerships forged in understanding rather than convenience. The woman who had once been branded a traitor for showing mercy had become a bridge between worlds that had learned to value connection over separation. Sometimes the greatest punishment wasn't death, but living long enough to discover that mercy could indeed change everything.